You're not going anywhere.
Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us to our panel, DIY labels and everything but the band. We're going to be talking about having a label, starting a label, why you should or shouldn't do it, some history of some of the wonderful labels we've got here, and, just general shit that people maybe aren't talking about enough today. This panel is hosted by the Holland Project, and the Holland Project, if you don't know, it's an all ages arts and music spot in Reno, Nevada. We do music shows, and obviously during COVID that's kind of slowed down, but we have been doing some music shows recently, getting back to it slowly, limited attendance, COVID protocols and stuff, but we're getting back to it. Otherwise, we do workshops, educational events, we do a girls rock summer camp and stuff. So a lot of stuff. And we're really the only all ages spot doing anything like that in Reno. So thank you to Holland Project for putting this on and for hosting this. Brigden is going to drop a little link in the chat here, so you can check us out and feel free to donate and online to support our programming. And yeah, we're just going to get started. So I'm going to let these people introduce themselves, but I'll just do a brief introduction. Today on this amazing panel, we've got Jensen and John, who co-run Iron Lung Records, Max Ward, who has been doing 625 Thrashcore for, 70 years or something, a pretty long time, and Grace Ambrose, who runs Thrilling Living. Jensen and John have some Reno roots, but they're a little bit more spread out these days. Max is on the East Coast, and that's why we're kind of doing this little bit of a strange time in the middle of the day. He lives in Vermont, and Grace is joining us from Kansas City, Missouri. So I'm just gonna let you guys introduce yourself before we get into it. I kind of call on you for this first round. Afterwards, we'll sort of open it up. And like I said, anyone on here, feel free to drop any questions that pop into mind into the chat. So first, kind of most general question, and Grace, I'll start with you. Maybe just quick introduction. Tell us about yourself and your label, and maybe just like your background with DIY music stuff.
Yeah, so I live in Kansas City, Missouri. I moved here from the Bay Area about a year and a half ago, like just before the pandemic. And I run a label called Thrilling Living. I started the label in 2016 while I was the content coordinator of Maximum Rock and Roll, which I coordinated for 3.5 or 4 years. That's why I moved to the Bay. It was both a project that totally changed my life, and I, was an amazing experience, but I also never hope to like recreate that kind of single-minded focus again. And that's part of why I started the label when I was there, because I felt like, okay, I'm doing this magazine. My life is punk, work is punk. Going to a punk show is like going to a meeting. Basically, everyone's got an opinion. They're trying to share it with me. You're the face of the magazine. You got to be like chipper and friendly to them all the time. And it's a magazine where if everything in the magazine was something that I loved, that would be a totally failed issue of the magazine. It's a magazine that was supposed to represent, or at least speak to, all like sort of subgenres of the punk community all over the world, with a global focus, a really big tent approach to punk in terms of sound, politics, to some extent, and geography. So I started the label while I was there in order to have a punk project that was able to sort of be like, this is my focus. And partially also because I was seeing a lot of inspiring things come through the door, and also living in the midst of a huge record collection there. Obviously the biggest punk record collection in the world, 56 or 7,000 records, and still growing. And I was really inspired by a lot of the amazing stuff, and also by a lot of like the crap. Like most of the shit in the Maximum record collection is like crap, sort of. And I thought I really wanted to do something that was really intentional in terms of the music, the way that things looked, and also be able to sort of be like, this is my project, and I'm allowed to have these sort of individual relationships with people, some of whom I met through the magazine, some of whom I had just met through my regular life in punk, and be able to have like a little bit of a more selfish engagement with it than I was able to at the magazine. Obviously, I'm no longer the coordinator of Maximum. I'm still doing the label. I have, in the past 5 years, I've put out 22 records. I have a couple more on the way. I'm working on a big book project about the band Kleenex from Switzerland that will hopefully be out early next year. And that's sort of where I'm at now. It's remained for me like a really fun way to engage with the punk community. And yeah, that's like sort of how I got started and what the focus is now. Thrilling Living, the name comes from the Scum Manifesto by Valerie Solanas. The idea you should seize some thrilling living for yourself. And I think the name speaks for itself in terms of like how I want the music that I release to make people feel and how I want to feel about, you know, approaching my life and my engagement to like both subculture and just everything that I do every day.
Awesome. Thanks, Grace. And we'll get back to some of those points later on. Max, you want to go next? Just tell us about yourself, about the label. I know it's a long story. So maybe, just whatever you feel like are the important points.
Sure. So I started the label in 1993, based, and the label is called 625. But before then, I released a few records of my own bands in 90, 91, mainly because no one was going to release them. And so basically DIY back then was basically, if you don't do it yourself, no one's really going to. And that meant setting up shows or printing your shirts or anything. This was in the late 80s, early 90s when pop punk was really popular in the Bay Area. It was also when a lot of A&R guys were, at Gilman trying to find the next Green Day and all this kind of stuff. And, the kind of music that I was into and what my friends were playing, which was, loosely what people now call grindcore, but it's just really kind of fast, noisy, thrash that was based off, DRI or the stuff that was happening in Europe in the mid 80s. Nobody was into that. And so we had to put out our own records. And so I put out my own band's records in collaboration with other people and other bands. And then by the time that I turned to my friends' bands from the local area, I said, well, I should probably come up with a label name. And we just chose 625 at the time. It was a local graffiti crew. And so chose that to focus just on the local scene. And then it just kind of expanded out, I basically took that same ethic of like trying to release bands that were fairly new, that weren't really getting covered, weren't popular by kind of the standards of the scene at the time, and probably contributed to a lot of the garbage that Grace mentioned in the MR like record collection, actually. So yeah, and I should say that I'm probably somewhat of an outlier here because I stepped away from really running the record label around 2004, 2005. And so I'm not, I'm not privy to a lot of the stuff that's happened over the last like 15 years. And Jensen can attest to that because he's babysat me on the phone saying, this is what social media is. This is how Bandcamp works. This, all this kind of stuff. So thank you, Jensen, for imparting knowledge to me because I literally have no idea what I'm doing right now. But it's, particularly because of the pandemic, I returned to it because it was a way for me to check in with friends, make sure everybody's doing okay, physically, mentally, and to meet new people as well and just like discover like new scenes and new bands of a younger generation, since now I'm nearing 50. And it's been really fun, starting last year, particularly during the pandemic. It's been kind of like the one little ray of light, as far as all the shit that we had to deal with, whether it's, presidential politics or the politics of, police brutality in the US and racism and shit. So, and everybody's been super supportive and nice. And so I'm really thankful that everybody just kind of readopted me, and I thank Jensen and Will from To Live a Lie and, everybody else, Brian Stern of Bad Skulls and Lisa and Kent of Ebullition, basically a lot of people who kind of had to get me up to speed of, what a DIY label means in 2021. So I'm looking forward to the conversation because I have a lot to learn. So.
Awesome. Thanks, Max. All right. Intro, Jensen and John. Let's hear about you guys a little bit and about Iron Lung, the label. Oh, I muted you because there was noise from your thing, Jensen. You got to unmute yourself. Sorry.
I was going to ask if you wanted us to do our scripted response that we came up with so that we talk in stereo at all times, or
Yes.
Or if I mean, I can tell a story too that's different than John's, because
I don't know. Yeah, there are two of you, so you're at a strict, distinct disadvantage. So yeah, you go ahead, Jensen.
I don't know if it's a disadvantage. I would call it an advantage because we're a bigger team than the rest of you guys. You're all single sticks in the wind. Yeah. Anyway, John and I play in a band together called Iron Lung, and so we thought really hard for a super long time about an engaging name to come up with for our record label, and we decided on Iron Lung Records because it's crazy enough to work. So we did it. We did it mainly too because the bands that we decided to release records for were bands that we played with and were our friends and weren't getting any sort of attention at all. Similar to how Max started up his thing, but we were playing with these bands, and they were unique bands and bands that we thought had voices that needed to be heard that wouldn't otherwise. So funnily enough, the first record that we put out was the Lords of Light single, which we sent to Maximum Rock and Roll, and Maximum Rock and Roll completely hated it, which I thought was hilarious. So
one person at Maximum Rock and Roll hated it. That's the cognitive perception.
But it was the review, which is everybody's first exposure, that was just like, I don't get it. This is terrible. And I really thought that that was the best start to the label that we could have had. Not because we had trouble with the record because of that or anything, but just because it was like, yep, okay, we're doing the right thing here. Like, people still don't get it and they never will. So we're just going to keep hammering that. And so we've been doing that for 13 or 14 years now. We started in 2007. We used money that we made from playing shows and touring to fund all of the records. And since then, it's sort of taken on a life of its own and become its own entity entirely. Because we as a band haven't been as active as we used to be for a myriad of reasons. Pandemic is a great one. We haven't practiced in a year and a half. So that should be pretty interesting when we get back to it. But it's been a great way to keep things rolling forward and just kind of keep our attention focused on bands that we think are important or that we just like. I mean, really, that's what it boils down to, is we like the stuff that we release, every single one of them. And so we want to share those things with other people. And with social media and everything being a part of DIY culture now, it's made it so much easier to connect people with music. Like, it's instantaneous now. So it's a gift, really. A total annoying pain in the ass gift sometimes, but a gift nonetheless. So that's kind of where we started and why we started, and where it goes from here. It's up to the people who make the music, really.
John, anything to add?
Well, so I started a label back in the early 90s and released a number of records. And
Are you referring to Satan's Pimp?
yes, I am. A name that I would probably never come up with now.
I just heard recently that was from a book.
From a book?
Yeah, there's a book called Satan's Pimp. It's like some old 60s pulp novel thing. Is that why? I never asked. I learned this fact today.
There's another reference to it too. But when we came up with the name, we were sitting in a coffee shop trying to think of an evil entity. What would be the most evil entity that you could think of? It wouldn't be Satan. It would be Satan's Pimp.
That's awesome.
Anyway, so ran that label for about 10 years. And I had a partner at a time during the label. We parted ways, but it was kind of the same thing. We started the label because we were in a band together, and no one was going to release our records. No one was going to do anything with the music that we were trying to create. So we decided that's what we're going to do. And again, we met people that we liked and their bands and decided to put out records for them. But I did get to a point where I couldn't do the label anymore. And I got really disheartened by the whole thing. So even in the beginning of when we were talking about Iron Lung, I was like, I'm a little scared, but you know, now I'm fine. So yeah, that's all I'm gonna add.
Okay, yeah, so let's you know, there's a lot of people on this call, and you know, I don't know people's backgrounds and stuff, but I think we can assume whatever your background, that you know, a DIY label now means something different, or at least that even the term is kind of a little bit more convoluted maybe than it once was, because you know, a lot of the tools that a DIY label is using, like the internet, everyone has access to, for example, right? So the question I kind of want to ask, and I'll just open this up to the whole panel, so whoever wants to kind of chime in, is sort of, can you define maybe what is a DIY label, and maybe what was a DIY label kind of when you started it, and if you kind of imagine doing a similar thing today, how might that look different? And I mean, the term DIY obviously has been thrown around and branded and rebranded, and hard to know really what that means, but it clearly means something. Maybe that's kind of what I want to define here a little bit. You know, like what's the difference between that and just like a platform to release music, which, you know, might already exist for younger people on the internet. And so they might not think that they need a label or something like that. So what is a DIY label? And this is open to anybody.
Ooh, who wants to jump in on that one first? I'll take that. So there's Bandcamp, and that's what a DIY label is. That's all. No, I'm just kidding. I mean, really, it describes the name of the thing, DIY, do it yourself, describes exactly what it is, because it was born out of, there was this wall that occurred between bands and the public where they had to get signed to a label and do a contract thing. And then the label would pay for the recording and pay for the advertising of the record that was going to become whatever. And then that band would be in debt to the label they would have to sell X amount of records to make back whatever money the label spent on the band. And so it sort of became this like, almost like a master and servant situation with a lot of bands. And I mean, there's countless stories of bands that should have made it or recorded the record, and the label canned it because they figured out after the fact that they weren't going to make any money on it. And so basically the DIY part of all of that is they've taken the gods and masters out of the equation, and we all just do it ourselves now, because we can be our own bosses. And it just takes, you scrape together a little bit of money and you can make a physical record. But now you don't even have to make a physical record. You can just upload it to a site, and literally everyone can access it for free and listen to whatever it is that you want to put out there, which is a pretty amazing thing. It's total freedom. And with that, there aren't filters that come with that. So literally anybody can put anything online and say, this is my thing, and listen to it. So I think that what like one of the functions of a DIY label now is sort of corralling some, I guess, it tastes or whatever. I know that with us, it's kind of weird because we put out a lot of different stuff, but it's all things that John and I like together, is like what we release. So in a way, that's kind of like, it's a way to sort of break down and organize everything that's coming out now. So I don't want to say that having a DIY label is like we're a glorified organizer, like, does this spark joy? Then we'll put it out. It's nothing like that. But it really is a label puts its stamp on a band. It says, you should listen to this. Like, that's kind of what it exists for now. Or at least that's part of it. Anything else you guys want to add to that? Grace?
Yeah, I mean, I think it also exists, like, not everybody is good at sending the mail on time, or paying the bills to the pressing plant, or meeting the deadlines, or a lot of bands they need like a little bit of an editorial perspective on them too. The number of times people have brought art to me and I've said like, there's no name on the front, your band name's on the record, you're dooming yourself to the dollar bin forever. That is where you will end up eventually, probably, but let's like delay that inevitability for a little bit. So it's also the person that's like, I have spent the time making connections with distributors, big and small, record stores all over the place, my mastering engineers, people that cut my lacquers, the plants that I work with, in order to make the best product. Because if in this day and age, when it's just so easy to like upload something online, if you're gonna make a record, you might as well make it like a really fucking good thing that you've put a lot of thought into like every element of it. And you know, it's the same way, like you call in different people to work on different parts of your house, or you know, there's an editor at the newspaper. And I think the DIY label aspect of that, particularly right now, as Jensen was saying, because everyone can put everything online, you know, anyway. I'm not trying to like make myself out to be some kind of taste maker, but it's helping to sort of sort through some of that and to help people access, you know, the sort of like nuts and bolts of making something that maybe they have no interest in, you know, finding the money, sending the emails, waiting the, you know, having your $1,000 deposit tied up for 9 months until the test presses come through. And that's a role here for sure. I think also too, like, I see myself fulfilling some of the roles of, you know, what like a bigger, more corporate commercial label might do too. You know, obviously I don't deal with advances with bands, but I also do help them like book tours or produce merch that they want to do, and like really trying to help people. You know, they want to see their band function in a certain way, and as their label, it's, you know, both like monetarily beneficial to me for them to go on tour, to you know, make, you know, connections or post their music online, whatever. But also I want the music to get out there, and I want to help people sort of like realize their dream. I like to sort of be like, I'm going to say yes until I absolutely have to say no when it comes to somebody being like, let's do this poster, let's do this gatefold sleeve, let's do whatever, and really help people sort through like what it is in terms of those choices that is like actually focused towards the goal of like making the product that they want to make.
Max, can we hear from you on this? Especially because I think your label, you know, definitely did a lot for kind of internationalizing at least like the hardcore scene and kind of the thrash world, and sort of really, you know, was focused a lot on demos, which I don't even know if people use that word anymore. So yeah, I want to hear from you on kind of the function of a label as far as like, you know, discovering music too, you know?
Yeah, I don't really know, actually. I mean, it's a good question. I think what the beauty of DIY is, or at least punk, if we can kind of shift the category a little bit, is just a constant process of self-reflection. You know, constantly saying like, is this the right thing to do? Is this a company that I want to work with? You know, is this how I should be ethically running something? And so I think that's, you know, for me, it's never been do it myself, because, you know, Dan from Spaz helped me with 625. Kent and Lisa from Ebullition are as much of 625 as I am, because, you know, they do so much for it and help me out. And of course, I'm calling Jensen at all hours of the day, just being like, Jensen, what is this thing called the internet? You know, how does a punk label like negotiate the internet? So you know, you're constantly working with people. And so I think, you know, getting back to one of the questions that you posed to the group over email when you invite us all here is, you know, thinking about that kind of tension between a do-it-yourself ethic, which is kind of like an anti-corporate, anti-business ethic, and also the necessity of doing it together, DIT, because I mean, we all, and that's probably where the label comes in. You know, if you're going to do it yourself now, there's all these platforms that are available. You can print your own record covers online. If you go, you know, on the internet, and you can probably find a printer, but it's going to be some corporate printer that's doing like mass, you know, business cards and postcards, and maybe they're going to do a 7-inch, but, you know, trying to direct those projects to like punk businesses. So, you know, whether it's punk presses or t-shirt presses, or, even pressing plants that are somehow, or lacquer cutting, that is somehow kind of punk related, or at least underground, I think, is an important aspect of kind of like DIY labels, even though, a product is still produced at the end. And, it may be difficult to see like, well, was this produced through kind of like corporate means, or was this produced through like underground means or whatever? But I think, a DIY punk label is going to be kind of aware of those things, of like who you're working with, who you're manufacturing your materials with, and those kinds of things. I would hope. Grace has something to.
I would hope. I think that actually, as soon as I finished my response, I was like, I think necessarily a DIY punk label has to be like an anti-corporate thing, which obviously is really hard when it's ultimately at the end of the day, we're running businesses. But I think like getting back to, it's like, I don't put any of my music on Spotify. If a band chooses that, if a band that I work with wants to do that, they can go ahead and do it. I don't put on Spotify, I don't put on Apple Music. I don't think of that as some kind of like moral failing if someone does. But for me, that's one of the places where I draw a line in terms of whatever kind of like financial remuneration I or the band is going to receive from that is like not worth like crossing my toe across that line. I think in the past 10 years, there has been so much blurring of corporate and like punk interests in a way of, bands playing a Converse sponsored show, or, giving interviews to Vice magazine, which is like a totally abhorrent, terrible media institution. And I think part of that, part of that sort of like slipping on that line, and like, I understand, you can think of Maximum as sort of like a sanctimonious whatever thing about its hard line about corporations and major labels and all of that. But I think some of this sort of like slipping in punk away from our sort of, self-contained like flow of capital, and more sort of on the internet, I'm going to make these step-by-step concessions towards working, playing this sponsored show, or putting my music in a commercial, or doing whatever for these momentary sort of glimpses, or, a momentary serotonin boost, or, that dopamine hit of sending your Vice interview around the internet for 2 days or whatever. I think that bands' willingness to do those kinds of things is like, can be directly linked to sort of the disappearance of institutions like Maximum. The fact that an organization like Ebullition, or an independent record distributor like Revolver, which is a place where I once worked, why those places are struggling in this moment, because people, it's okay to be hard, like a little bit hardline about stuff. Sometimes it might seem a little bit ridiculous, but I think too, in this idea of, if we're going to be thinking about the sort of like future imaginary revolutionary potential or whatever, we might as well imagine these standards or different realities for ourselves, and try to hold ourselves to that, every day. And I think, yes, in an ideal world, a DIY punk label would be thinking all the steps through. I think there's some of the idea of like, people use this phrase, the idea that there is no ethical consumption under capitalism, as a way to totally excuse any choices that they might make, and that are actually, being made for their own convenience or comfort or whatever. But there are more ethical choices that can be made, or just thinking about that.
Yeah, I think that's one thing that I love about punk, and also growing up in the Bay Area. Martin Sprouse and Tim Yohannan basically shaped my politics, and of course MDC and Dead Kennedys and stuff. So, it's like we have the same question always. Before it was CDs, good or bad. Tim Yohannan at first was like, we're not reviewing CDs, and then of course MR had to. Barcodes. Do we review something with barcodes? Because what are barcodes? Like, what punk DIY store is going to have a barcode reader? It was only at the time Tower or HMV or whatever that had that. So, are you producing your CDs or your records to, sell in places with barcodes? And I think it's interesting now, just with how sneaky the digital platforms have come in and really presented themselves as like, this is for you. This is just a platform to assist you to get your creativity out there, which can, without, if you're not vigilant, that sounds like a neoliberal version of punk right there. It's just like, you're doing it yourself or whatever. And the great thing about punk is having these questions, kind of being always forced to like think about like, where is the line? What am I comfortable doing, and what should be people be called out on, or what is somewhat acceptable, and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, that's the one thing that I really appreciate. And I'm also still, coming back to this now, I'm also trying to figure out where those lines are. I haven't gone across the digital divide except for Bandcamp. And I'm still, every day when I get these reports from Bandcamp, like, the thing you're selling for $6, you made $3.75 on it, and I'm like thinking like, wait, why am I doing this? Why am I paying $20 a month to this thing, and PayPal's taking a cut and all this stuff? Like, isn't there a way that I could just give, sell this so I can give, 50, 60% of the royalties to the bands or whatever, and so I'm still trying to figure out where that line is for myself, so it's important to have these kinds of collective conversations about what it means to, run a label these days.
Yeah, it was interesting. Sorry, I'm just going to keep going if this is okay with everybody. It was interesting earlier, Jensen was said these, like the word boss, like you're the boss and you're putting stuff online. And I actually think that there's a conversation to be had sort of like from a Marxist perspective of Bandcamp as the boss and like us as the workers or whatever, and what's happening right now with how they're framing it as, you are in charge, you are making this money, you are making these choices, we are artist centered, we're doing this for you, but actually we're making money for them like hand over fist. It's a multi-million-dollar tech company, and there definitely are conversations that need to be had, about how do we redistribute resources to the people who have had money, who have had access systematically withheld from them, even by DIY punk labels that have been replicating sort of like oppressive forces of capital and racism and, misogyny all the time, despite our best efforts. But like, how do we do that without putting our trust in the multi-million-dollar company that's like trying to consolidate everything in one place right now? And that's the question I think of, like when you come to, putting a barcode, like Maximum had to put a barcode on the magazine itself after its like long fight. And then it's like, I read a Maximum Rock and Roll for the first time in Barnes and Noble in Bethesda, Maryland. And like, that's how it got there. And so where the line between like making that kind of concession and then dealing with a platform like Bandcamp that is framing itself as sort of like a tool for you, when I think you're really right, Max, that a really good use of all of our time and resources and energy would be to be developing like actual open source sustainable platforms to do all this. But also at the end of the day, this is sort of my hobby. I don't have, a ton of fucking time. And also my label is not going to like change the world or beat back the sort of totally like the typhoon of capitalism that is coming. But that, that goes contrary to what I was saying, like, in the question, my response before, which is, I believe in the power of imagination and sort of thinking about these like ideal temporary utopias and, where is that value there?
So our label, we put everything on digital platforms all across the way, but we kind of leave that decision ultimately up to the bands that we work with, because in an ideal world, sure, nobody would make money off of our music except for us, but it's foolish to think that that's possible at all, because it's not. There's a way to disseminate information or message, right? So like, you have a band and this band has something to say, and obviously you're going to want that band to say that message to as many people as you can get it to. And I know that using certain platforms for that can be questionable, depending on the message, but in the end, I kind of leave that decision up to the bands and how they want to present their vision. And a lot of them, almost all of them, want their music to be everywhere. And I look at it as a way to sort of subsidize the physical product, because any money that we get from any digital sales, we kind of use that to supplement the physical things that we're making, because making these physical things is such an expensive thing to do now. And a long time ago, it was very cheap to make records. And the reason that there were so many punk records is because they were cheap to make. And that was the only way that those bands could afford to get that message out. And so now it's sort of taken that idea and it's shifted to making a record, which is kind of like a niche product at this point, or almost a novelty. And then, but then, you know, people will be mad that they buy a record and it doesn't come with a download code in it so that they can actually listen to it. Because people will buy records, they don't even have record players. Like it's crazy to me that that's a thing now. But so I like to look at all of the money that we get from any sort of digital downloads or streaming or anything like that, which is nothing. I mean, those companies pay fucking nothing for streams. It's a joke, but we use that to sort of supplement our physical products and try and keep the prices on our records as low as we can, so that they can continue to circulate and come out and be physical things that you can actually hold on to. Because I think that the physical part of music is very, very important, because you need to be able to look at a piece of artwork and be able to read the lyrics and be able to see what this band wants you to see, instead of just seeing what comes up on a screen. Because I think that it's a misrepresentation of an album to just see the cover art in a little tiny screen. So I don't know, but we do put our stuff up on all these.
Can I add something from a historical perspective?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, from like, so in the 90s, this same exact question was about CDs. So, you know, for if you put out a CD, the big lie at the time was that the record companies had to pay for the new technology to make the CD. So for the first couple of years, CDs were going to come out to be $15, $16. Even though to actually make a CD back then was like 75 cents, even after paying Madonna royalties or whatever, you know, but they held the price up, you know, quite high. You know, and so once, you know, punk labels started doing CDs, you know, you could do them for cheaper. They were so incredibly cheap to make, and you could sell them cheaper than an LP. But actually, if you sold, you know, 1,000 or even 600 of a, you know, 1,000 press CD for a label like mine, I could then put those resources into doing 2 or 3 EPs of bands that nobody knew of. So, you know, for every What Happens Next CD that I did, I was able to, you know, put out 3 or 4 unknown bands on EPs. And so that was kind of the equation at the time. Like, I hate CDs. They're just glorified digital transporters, you know, basically. And, you know, the artwork sucks on them. You can't read the lyrics. It's too small. Just everything kind of sucks about them. But it was a way where, I think, getting back to what Jensen's saying, you know, that you can use, you know, some of the money that you're getting from that medium, even if it's a questionable medium, and you can actually, you know, reinvest it, you know, into something worthwhile. So it's interesting to hear this conversation now, you know, because it reminds me of kind of the debates that we're having in the 90s about basically CDs. Like, do you do a CD? Like, what's the use of a CD? Is it a viable format? You know, and all these kinds of things. So,
see, I'm like maybe the sucker here, but like I give all Bandcamp's the only platform I have to do digital on. I give 100% of the digital royalties to the band, because I didn't do, I mean, I did something, I like packaged it, branded it or whatever. But ultimately that's a way for them to be making that like money, that they made the music, they did that. I also split the royalties on the records 50-50 with the band once it makes its money back. And, you know, if I was running my business, maybe if I needed this business to like make money to pay my wages, maybe I would do it differently. But right now the records do pay for themselves. And I've only ever had that it not pay for itself once. They all make money. I know that's like maybe not, you know, if I had a larger sample size of several hundred records, that might not be the case. But just putting that out there as like a sort of just example. And then also for me, it's interesting, Jensen, that you say people write to you and are like, where's the download code? When I do download codes, I like look at the redemption rate, and it is so low that it's like not worth the paper that it was printed on, basically. So I would much rather, you know, I don't put this anywhere on my website, but people email me all the time and say like, can you send me, I bought the record, here's my, you know, a picture of it or my receipt or whatever, will you send me the WAV files? And I say, sure, why not? But it's just interesting to me. I feel like people who buy records are buying records, and people who buy downloads or stream music are buying downloads and streaming music, and that those aren't necessarily the same people. And like, yeah, I mean, right now, making a 7-inch, I don't know how much people in the chat are aware of this, is like a losing proposition at this. A 7-inch is so expensive to make at this point, but also it's the quintessential punk format. And I really believe that records should be put on the format that, like, you know, don't write 5 extra songs to try to stretch it out to a 45 RPM 12-inch or an LP. Like, you know, a 6-song 7-inch and all the songs are less than a minute long, like, sign me up. That is like the ideal, the platonic ideal of a punk record. So it's that balance too, where you're like, well, this is an object that is like, if I sell all of them, I'll make my money back in a little bit, then some, if I'm not, because I'm not willing to sell them for like $12 a piece or whatever, which is probably what you should sell a 7-inch for with the cost of manufacturing. But yeah, it's interesting. I would say, Jensen, if they're paying you so little from Spotify and iTunes, wouldn't it be like better to be like, we're going to make a badass Iron Lung shirt or badass whatever that's going to make, you know, this amount of money back in a year?
Yeah, or we could do both of those things. But in the end, I look at it as it's just another vehicle to get a message out. You know, like, that's kind of its purpose, in my opinion. That's the purpose of streaming in general, is that it allows access to as many people as can handle it. And I don't know, I mean, if we don't put it up there, then someone else is just going to put it on YouTube, or some blog is going to put it up for a free download, which is fine. I mean, a bunch of the stuff that we have up on our Bandcamp pages are free downloads too. Like, we try to make it as available as possible. And I like to use the tools that I have to make that a reality.
I'm just gonna put a pin in it here, just because I do want to kind of, I feel like this is a super important conversation, and we probably could talk about it for the rest of the time. And I feel like it remains unresolved, and it's kind of, it demonstrates maybe a sore spot in general right now in this like little bit of a weird turning point, especially after this past year, of like how much we're willing to upload our lives into the internet and how much we want to keep them off of there. And I would want to keep talking about it, but I also want to talk about some other label stuff and some things you guys mentioned. And in particular, I kind of want to tease out, yeah, like Jensen, you said, the physical aspect of it. And in an interview with you, Max, I read kind of, once upon a time, I feel like, especially when you're a kid and you like go to a record store and you like don't know what you want, you sometimes make decisions basically based on like what the record looks like, you know, like you just look at this thing and you're like, okay, does it have enough spikes on it? Is it black and white? You know, is it scary? And then like you have no idea what it's going to sound like, but you can kind of make this educated guess that like 90% of the time you're right, you know. And that's a big deal, because that's like getting people to listen to something from zero. Like, this is a kid that has no idea what this is. Their friend didn't recommend it. You know, they didn't see a blog post about it. They just found it for this reason, right? And we're in a little bit of a different world now, right? That type of discovery is a little bit more rare, but it's not totally gone. And I feel like that's one thing that the label does is artwork, right? And like curate the physical product. And it's something that your guys' labels in particular, right? It's a big part of what you do. So I kind of want to talk about that. And I want to talk about the label's role. Like we talked about the DIY part of the name, right? The label part of the name, if you just think about it literally, right? It's like a label basically tells the consumer, or let's use a more neutral word, tells the listener, like, what is this, right? Is this a pink lady apple, or is this whatever, heirloom or whatever, you know, so you know what it is, right? So as the label, part of your job is to present this thing. So I kind of want to hear you guys talk about how that works. And especially now, especially Max, like at this point, you know, I don't even know how many records you've put out. Certain types of artwork are no longer shocking, right? And certain things, certain fonts maybe get used a lot, you know, and certain design tricks, you know, that used to work don't work anymore. And so what's that process like with bands, right? Like how much as a label do you feel like you actually, how much do you know, are you ready to be like, this looks like shit, this thing that you sent me, we're going to have to do something else. Let me connect you to this person. And I want to remind the people in the chat too, please drop in any questions and stuff, because part of what I want to steer people listening to is also the idea that like, you can do a label even if you just put out one tape for your friend, right? That still counts. And part of the fun part about that is like, maybe you like your friend's band and you want to make artwork for them, right? That's something that's like an entry point for a lot of people. So I kind of want to open up to you guys. What's been sort of like, what's the process of artwork, right? How important is that to you? And how much do you put into that from the perspective of, well, somebody who has no idea what this sounds like, will they want to listen to it based just on this picture or on this record cover, you know? Maybe they're already in this world, maybe they're not. How much do you even think about that? Like, are you trying to attract a new listener, or are you just trying to basically retain the people, the audience that you already have, because you want to give them something they already expect?
That's a tough question. I have to say, I leave everything up to the bands, and then, you know, they'll send me stuff that may not work, and I'll have to contact a designer, you know, like a DIY punk designer, and say, oh, you know, can you help get this in the templates right? But I do just try and give the band as much leeway as possible. I mean, I've gotten some stinkers in the past for sure. And, you know, there you have to kind of, you know, make that decision of like, am I just going to let the band determine this record cover, even though it looks pretty bad? Or can I make suggestions on how to improve it? Or it's just basically, you know, you literally get a, you know, cut and paste glued piece of paper in the mail, and you have to turn that into a print ready, you know, record cover. And, you know, some, at least, you know, young punk bands may not know how to do that. And so, you know, I just connect people. So it's like, you know, the audio goes to this mastering house, you know, Will Dead Air, trying to keep it like within the punk world. You know, printing goes to Econopress in Oakland, or if somebody wants to do shirts, so like send them to, you know, Brian or at Bad Skulls or something like that. So it's more of kind of just trying to have a network of people that can assist with kind of getting this like prepared, you know. But you know, as far as kind of like what the 625 sound is, just to talk about, you know, the like how my label is associated, it's quite interesting. You know, grindcore fiends like are like, oh, 625 is a grindcore label, you know, because they you know, they have the 10 grindcore records that they, you know, that I put out. And then, you know, the Y2K thrash revival stuff, you know, then they're like, oh yeah, no, that was like kind of like the early 2000s thrash revival. What happens next? Lifesalt, you know, tear it up or whatever. Okay, so 625 label is that. You know, I've put out like Young Offenders, Giant Haystacks. I've put out, you know, I put out all like early West Bay bands too. So like kind of like trying to sum up what the 625 sound or image is, you know, or like trying to, you know, it's never in my mind of like, oh, I need, you know, if somebody sends me something, is this 625 material? Because I don't know what that is. You know, it's, I guess it goes back to kind of what the others are saying, you know, as far as like, oh, I really like this, you know, and I don't think anybody else is going to put this out. So maybe I should, you know, and which means I pass up actually quite a lot of really, really good stuff just because I know it's going to be put out by somebody else, you know, but I never have an idea of like, this fits the 625 mold, and then I'm going to be able to put the stamp of 625 on it and people may buy it. I'm not exactly sure people actually purchase stuff because of that, you know, because it's kind of an eclectic label to a certain extent, I guess, maybe just at least in the past. I don't know if that answers your question or
not. I'll say this, artwork, to me, artwork is very important for a record. Things need to look good. And I remember for the longest time, there was this, people were discovering Photoshop and not using it effectively at all. So a lot of things would come out very pixelated and just looking really trashy and cheap. And it didn't really do those records any justice, because there's been some really good records made in the world that have terrible artwork. And I feel like they would have just been passed by or treated as trash because they don't look like they should. And so artwork is very important. And obviously, if you're running a label and you know how you want things to look, not necessarily like, oh, I specifically want this to be a photocopied black and white image with a blurry dick on the front, or whatever the fuck it is that you want to have on the front. you have an idea of an overall aesthetic. And I think that at least in my case anyway, my opinions on art certainly affect what is submitted to me. Because if somebody sends me something that I don't think is going to work for the music or for that band specifically, I'll say like, hey, maybe you want to rethink this, or maybe we could try to like do something else. Or I've even gone as far as like, hey, I came up with this artwork because this is what came to my mind when I listened to your record when you sent me the masters early on or something before the art was done. And so there's a lot of different ways to approach having the right artwork for a record. And I think having some more opinions on the matter is helpful at times. Obviously, when there's someone who's really strong-willed and is like, no, this is what it is, then like, you kind of have to compromise, I guess. But yeah, artwork I think is immensely important, and for it to be done well and to be eye-catching, and having a person in charge of, or not in charge, but involved with knowing how things look good is very, very helpful. I'm fortunate that John has an excellent eye for artwork, because I've leaned on him a lot over the years for his opinion, because it's so dead on. And I mean, I have my own tastes too, but obviously like his are better than mine.
John, would you agree?
No. I don't know if I have an excellent eye, but I mean, yeah, I like things to look good. I don't know. But again, there's the artist, and they may have a vision, and sometimes that vision is stronger than the opinion, so sometimes you have to go with it.
Yeah.
Generally though,
There's
okay.
a couple things we've released where I'm like, ooh, I don't know about this artwork, guys. And they're like, nah, just go with it. It's going to work. And they were right. And in the end, it ended up working out. But I've definitely shot down a few things that have come across our table and been like, this is awful. I hate looking at it. I can't, there's no way we can release this record. It's terrible. But it all worked out. So it's okay. But yeah, bands, if you're thinking about making a record, just make it look good, please. Try. If you don't think you can do it, just try something else. Or maybe your friend's really good at art and have them do it. It's okay. It just has to look good.
Grace, anything to add? Especially because I feel like your label is maybe sonically, it's maybe a little more, I don't know, I don't want you to take offense at the term eclectic, but kind of, and it's a newer label too. So I feel like as,
I would say it's as Iron Lung is very eclectic in a similar way, I think. I am, Max, admittedly not as familiar with the 625 catalog. I am one of the bands on Iron Lung Records that was like, Jensen, take our music off of Spotify right now. But
and we did.
And you did. Yeah. I actually would say like part of my enthusiasm from art actually comes from like some of that experience I had. I was in a band called Mozart. We hand painted something on every single cover of the record. They're all completely different. And Jensen and John were like so enthusiastic and excited about that. And it was the kind of thing that made me feel like, okay, there are people in this world who like do care about a lot of this stuff. Because I've been in bands too and deal with bands who like sort of don't care what the art is, which is kind of mind-blowing to me. I think those are some of the same people who like don't collect records, who maybe listen to lots of music and go to lots of shows, but aren't into record collecting. Like I think probably, everyone on this panel is to some extent. And that's really interesting to me. I think that talking about the art can be like the most touchy subject for everybody, like even more so than the music. Sometimes, I mean, I have had huge blowout fights with bands about, you need to take this back to get mixed again. You need to trust me. You've been listening to this for 6 months, like you gotta go. But like the biggest, the touchiest, most sort of like the diplomacy really has got to come out when it comes to the art sometimes. And you know, I look back at some of the stuff that I did that I think has really great art, but like my worst selling record is the best record I ever put out. It's for a band called SBSM from Oakland. It's a black on black silk screen cover. It doesn't look like, it's beautiful. It's amazing. The records are like hand bound with a little thread. They're so cool. This band is incredible. I like threw 100 of them out when I moved to the Midwest. It's the only record I've ever had to throw some out of. And that I think partially came down to the art, like especially online, it just looks like a black square basically, and it's not going to sell. And that's like, has to be part of it too. There's like the sort of line between like, yes, I want to respect your artistic vision all the way. And also like, and I think that the artistic vision of SBSM is exquisite and perfect. And like, I actually wouldn't probably change anything about the record now that I'm saying that, but like, there also is considerations to think about, like the sort of marketability or like how it's going to look in the bins at the record store, like all of that too. Yeah. I also work at a print shop, so I have a lot of access to certain things that, and I also see a lot of stuff that gets manufactured in our shop that both inspires me and also makes me think about like what not to do or what to do, you know, in the future. And that's been really awesome too, to be able to have that kind of resource to like sort of play around and explore with stuff has been huge in terms of, especially being able to offer bands like, oh yeah, you want to do a crazy risograph zine on the inside? Let's figure it out. Let's do it. So yeah.
Max, were you going to add something?
Yeah, actually, I was gonna assume your role and pose a question actually, and because it's something that haunts me, and I don't actually have an opinion of. One thing that I think is great about punk versus other music communities is that we're aware of the contradictions that we're in. You know, like other places just kind of go with it, other music, but you know, we constantly have these conversations about. We know that there's no outside. You know, there's no socialists outside that we can just go occupy and then be like, fuck capitalism, you know, we're in it, you know, and we have to deal with it. Right. But we're aware of that and we have to navigate that contradiction. So, you know, I was a huge record collector and it meant so much to me. And at some point, particularly when I had started having to move across the US and stuff, and I had to take this gigantic 20-year record collection with me, I started thinking like, I'm not even listening to these. You know, they're sitting in white boxes. And so like, at what point are these just like commodities that I'm fetishizing for some kind of value that they have? That's actually not the value of just me sitting down and having the time to be able to take them out and like listen to them properly and, you know, read through the liner notes like I did, you know, 15 years ago. So, you know, on the one hand, we talked a lot about like digital and what kind of effect that's had on like DIY, like punk. But then on the other hand too, like at what point are we fetishizing an object, a material object? And what does that mean as far as like what we're trying to achieve, you know, as like a community? Because I hear everybody about like the importance of, you know, having this thing like, you know, look good, you know, a band being proud of, you know, getting this record, you know, out, as well as a label also having that input, you know. But I also feel like, as you know, a prior avid record collector to the point of like sickness, you know, at what point does that become too much as well, that we're just fetishizing this object that, you know, I don't know, in 20 years, is it going to be $300 on eBay? And is that what we were trying to do? Or like, you know, yeah. So I'm just, you know, putting that out there is just kind of like another question for people. Can we fetishize an object too much? Can we fetishize our own releases too much?
Definitely.
Absolutely.
Yes. Yeah. I think the answer to everything you just said is yes.
I mean,
Yeah.
I'd also add to that, you know, today's pixelated thing might be tomorrow's cool look, vintage look, you know.
Pixelation will never look cool.
No, pixelation is like,
Will never look cool.
no.
All right. Okay. This is being recorded, Jensen. So we'll play that back for you in a few years.
Pixelation will never look cool. Digital
That little
typewriter
sound
font.
clip on all the streaming platforms too. Never gonna look good, no matter how hard you try. I remember one time we were taking a band with us on tour, and they sent me the artwork for a T-shirt that they wanted to make for the tour, and all of the artwork in the shirt was pixelated. And I wrote him back and I was like, this isn't going to work. It's all pixelated. And he was like, no, we want it that way on purpose. I was like, why would you want it to look bad on purpose? And they're like, well, so it's a picture of a megaphone. And I think that there might have, they were from Europe. And so I think there might've been like a translation thing, but they saw in Photoshop, there's a function on there called distortion. And so they distorted the image and all it did was make it pixelated. But they're, you know, and they're thinking of it like, yeah, it's so loud and crazy that it's distorted, but all it does is look like shit. So they lost on that one. But we made the shirts for them anyway, because ultimately that was their vision and that's what they wanted. And they went home with a lot of distorted t-shirts.
Pixelation is like retro chic now, though. Like people are doing it intentionally.
Ugh, God.
Can
I mean, Max, I think what you were saying about commodities is like, obviously like a meaningful community is not built on the exchange of commodities or whatever. So when these objects become completely divorced from the community, whether that is, you know, the touring networks that have been built up that mean that like, you know, any one of us could be in any city in the world and find like a couch to sleep on. Like, in some ways, the records that we made were the units that like helped people travel around the world and get there. Like, you know, the $5, you know, $5 in the gas tank at a time or whatever. And once these commodities become totally divorced from like the community aspect of it, then it just becomes like, you know, a strip mall of punk records or whatever, which I'm not interested in. And that's one of the things to be thinking about this past year when like, I would say that record sales got better over the past year than they were like the 2 years beforehand. I don't know, you know, there's all kinds of reasons you could theorize about that. But then for part of me, it's been like, you know, this sort of sad thing where it does feel more like I'm just like running a store that makes an object or whatever. Though of course, like, you know, the music is still being put into the world, the conversations are still being started by the bands, but it is missing some of that like element of the community that gives that sort of exchange of commodity a different kind of framework that we're working within.
Yeah, and I'll say from that perspective, a label does sort of serve a different function, you know, that we've talked about a little bit, because on one hand, it's like the individual tastes maybe of a DIY label, but the bands that sort of come together under that umbrella, you know, they kind of form this sort of ad hoc community of bands that are all on this label, even though they might be from all across the world, even though they might not have ever met each other, right? But they are then sort of kind of become part of this group that might mean something. And you as the label are kind of the core, the nexus of that, right? And that community aspect of it, especially kind of in the underground world or whatever they were talking about, that might be the more important thing, right? The object, the band, the show, like all of these things, right? Like they come and go, you know, they, you know, I mean, especially bands, you know, like here today, gone tomorrow, or after the show or whatever, you know, but the label is a little bit more of like a lasting conduit, right? Or it can be, especially if it does stick around for a long time, even if it goes through a period of hiatus, right? So maybe talk about personally for you as the label people, clearly it's something fun, you like doing this stuff. And, you know, I could ask, you know, there's probably a lot of personal reasons, right? Why you, for yourself, why you might be doing it, but talk a little bit about your role, what the label might mean to other people, right? To the people on your label, or what you think it might mean, right? Does, you know, are they proud of having a record on Iron Lung? You know, is that something that means something to them, even if they only ever put out one record and never played any shows? You know, is that something that lasts, you know, is that kind of a contribution to like the community project that you're making?
There've been, on almost every single release that we've ever done, there's a point sometime during production where either the band will like specifically write to us and say like, hey, thank you so much for like giving us a chance to make this record. And to me, that tells me that it's something special, not only to them, but it's special to me too. Like I've even written thank you letters to bands that we've released records for, like saying, hey, you know, thanks for putting this record out with us, because we love this so much. And we want to continue to like amplify what it is that you're doing. And it's a really important thing. And to have the bands feel similarly is really rewarding. Like really, it really is. We're so fortunate to be able to work with the people that we get to work with, because they mean so much to us. And they're really, we all have a hand in making punk what it is. I mean, it's not just me, it's not just Grace, it's not just Max, like it's all of us. We all have to make our own world, essentially. And so if everybody can come together in a sort of a like-minded situation and make such a wonderful thing, then that's really fortunate for everyone else that gets to buy whatever the end commodity of that is, because they get to see what we worked so hard on collectively. And so, yeah, I mean, it's really the amount of gratitude that happens in our exchanges. I mean, I can only obviously speak to our exchanges, but just the amount of gratitude that I've experienced as a two-way street has been really life-changing in a lot of ways. Was I supposed to answer more to that?
I have to say there's no purpose for my label to exist. You know, a lot of the bands that I'm releasing now, even though I've identified them probably as not cool and probably maybe going under the radar from other labels, at some point are probably going to be able, you know, to get releases out on other labels and stuff. So I really don't, you know, I don't think I have necessarily a purpose. And so to get, you know, as far as like Jensen's point, as far as how much gratitude all of us and all our labels have for the bands that have given us kind of inspiration, I have to say, you know, speaking with Max from Internal Rot and the guys in Melbourne who are like, we love 625, we love all those old like records, like, you know, they've collected the shirts and they've, you know, all this stuff, and they're like, you got to use the old logo and you got to do this and you got to do that. And I'm like sitting there going like, do you really care? Like, you know, back then nobody cared. You know, we couldn't get a show at Gilman to save our lives, you know, like, or whatever. But now, like, you know, people cared, and that was returned, you know, and, you know, people kind of getting kind of stoked, you know, and expressing their happiness about, you know, whatever releases or some bands that I played in the past has then rekindled that and said, oh, you know, actually, like maybe, you know, I've gotten so much support, particularly for the bands that I played in from the scene, that I still like need to give back, you know, and for all these people who are, you know, it's a very small contingent, very small world, you know, who were stoked on like a lot of the old 65 releases, have expressed that to me and got me back into it. And the only reason I'm still doing that is because they've, you know, sat me down at some point, you know, maybe at a show or over dinner or something, and just like kind of expressed, you know, their appreciation of some of the old records. And it just kind of made me think like, oh shit, well, okay, like maybe, you know, at least I have something to contribute, or at least I can continue this network of friendship, you know, by maybe continuing and trying to find like new bands that fit within some kind of category of, you know, what appeals to me or whatever, much like the older bands that these people are now appreciating. And so like, I really have to say, like, the only reason that I'm continuing to do this, because I have no purpose. There are other labels that could do this, you know, probably more professionally, a whole lot better than what I can. You know, still it's because of the, you know, the gratitude that people have expressed to me, and that's just kind of like given me inspiration to, you know, like continue, I guess.
Yeah, I guess I would say I hope that people feel proud to, or like, you know, at home on the label. One of the sort of projects of the label is that, you know, and this has never been, I've never said this anywhere, I don't write this on anything, like every band that I've ever released has women in it. And that is not true of most punk labels. It's very purposefully not something that I'm trying to like advertise or commodify or like make a thing of, make some kind of like othering thing out of. But it's really interesting to me, the kind of people that are able to recognize that that's what's going on. And it's because it's people like myself who are women who have like been in the punk scene for a long time, who have been, you know, filled all different kinds of roles played in bands, booked shows, ran fanzines, ran labels or whatever. And those are the people that are able to sort of like see that project for what it is, despite the fact that it's not being advertised as such quite purposefully. You know, and I go, you know, it's like, it's a feminist project. It's an anti-racist project. It's like trans inclusive project, all of that. And that's like the main kind of like community that I'm trying to build around it in terms of like the friendships that I'm developing with the people that the bands that I'm working with. And yeah, I mean, I guess, yes, it is like probably very like eclectic in sound, in a way that is also sort of trying to like push back on this idea of, you know, it's interesting. There's like a couple bands that like modern music writers think like anyone that writes about like any release I put out, I put out the Good Throb LP in a previous label that only had one release. Anyone that writes about like any music that I release is like, sounds like Good Throb. And you're like, do you have ears? Like what's going on here? So it's interesting to see like how some people sort of like see this sort of like feminist aspect of it but aren't able to like kind of, I don't want to be like, the men can't see the complexity of or whatever, because obviously it's not some kind of binary like that. And I'm not trying to, you know, make any kind of sweeping statement like that. But to me, it's interesting who the people are that sort of recognize the community that has like kind of been built around the label. And for the most part, it feels like people like myself who like this was a kind of community that they were looking for and looking towards. So yeah, that's what I'm like sort of, you know, that might be the thread that connects, you know, all the releases on the label more so than like a sound or a particular scene. Though you see, like I lived in London for, you know, 18 months. I've released a bunch of bands from London. Like, you know, I traveled to Mexico and met some people. And then there was this kind of spurt of time on the label where I was releasing bands from a particular, you know, subsection of the punk scene in Mexico. Like, so there are these kind of like, you know, momentary connections within the label, but in terms of like the bigger picture, this sort of like feminist project is how I see it.
So we got about 15 minutes left here. We do have one question so far from the Q&A. I do want to really encourage anybody here to drop your questions in the chat before, you know, we got a few minutes for sure. So if you drop it in now, I'm sure we'll have some time to address it. I want to kind of put one bigger question as kind of my final one before we go to the Q&A, which is kind of in an interview with you, Grace, in the media, that online thing, you know, you kind of talked about sort of, you kind of push back on the idea that there's no underground. And I kind of want to put it to you guys now that is using the term underground music, does that still make sense? You know, is that really a term that has any weight to it, you know, particularly because it's very, I mean, it's hard to find something that's hard to find these days, you know, like even a band from the middle of nowhere, wherever, they can put their music out there, right? Chances are they have a phone, they can record it on the phone and put it on the internet, right? Any technical limitations, any limitations of distance, all of those things, right? They're not really there anymore. But that doesn't necessarily mean that there can't be kind of an underground. It maybe just means we have to readjust the way that we think about what that is. If it's something more intentional, where is the stuff that we're not hearing? You know, like there's some band playing in some, you know, house in the valleys here in Reno, right? That for whatever reason, like we just don't know about them, right? So is there an underground? Is that relevant? You know, is that term really relevant? Is it about your intentions or your politics or whatever? Or is that kind of something that is now just more of a brand that, you know, will help people sell stuff, but maybe maybe there's even a way to kind of distance yourself from that because you don't want to exploit that idea. Like no one's ever heard of this band, so you have to buy it kind of. So yeah, maybe talk about that. Where's the underground? Where do we find it? And are we even looking for it anymore? Or are we having a different conversation these days?
I think the other part of that quote that you pulled out was me being sort of illustrating this concern of like, the most popular, the bands that were sort of like being hyped in the moment of the time that interview came out, it was like sort of like Lumpy and the Dumpers and Coneheads and Vex, and like those are the same bands that were being written about by corporate media. So my question with that quote was sort of like, what is it about these bands? Like, should we be concerned that the same bands that are being valorized and are like popular in the scene right now are the same bands that are being sort of like picked up by like the Noisies and the Pitchforks and et cetera of the world? And I think my answer to that question is still the same. It's like, there are tons of kids all over the place playing punk music, making techno, like, you know, underground, like rap. That is like all happening. It still is happening. It was happening in front of everyone's eyes in the pages of Maximum, like every month, where you're getting these kind of demos and, you know, even records from bands that are maybe not looped into the exact same sort of punk scene that those of us in this Zoom room find ourselves in, which at the end of the day, you know, it feels like this big like global totality that we're all a part of. But the particular punk scene that like 625 and Iron Lung and Thrilling Living exists in is only one like very small aspect of the global punk scene, even if it is like international and global in its scope. And I'd say, yeah, there's still an underground. There's kids fucking everywhere. There's old ass men playing, you know, in a grindcore band in the basement. Like, and to think otherwise is to sort of position ourselves as some kind of like all-knowing, all-seeing people or whatever. We are just like, you know, a couple people who have a pretty limited but vast in some ways perspective on what's going on. And yeah, I don't know what the underground like means necessarily. I guess for these purposes, it's just like people doing shit that we don't know about that's like kind of exists in like a different kind of network. But yeah, it's like the same as those bands that you meet when you go on tour and you end up on the same show as them and you're like, oh, we don't have any friends in common. We do exist in totally different worlds. We're just here this night on this thing. The punk scene's, you know, a lot bigger than Instagram would have you think.
Is also kind of have to ask ourselves what's the line of ground, whether you're above it or under it. In my opinion, I really think that if the band chooses to put their music online or tell anyone online anywhere. So to me, the internet is essentially what constitutes underground and above ground music. And as Grace said, I mean, there's tons and tons of bands that play, and some of them intentionally don't put anything out there for you to hear. Like, you have to go see them and you have to know them. So I think that a lot of the like underground mentality, and rightfully so, exists in a regional way where people are like, well, I'm from this town, and so all of my friends that go to my school all know who my band are, and I'm going to keep it that way because I don't give a shit what like some guy in Wyoming thinks or some guy in fucking France or whatever. Like, they're never going to see me. I'm never going to meet them. So why should I give a fuck if they hear my band? And so there is a lot of intentionally unheard music and exposed music because they don't want it that way. And I think that's the essence of what underground really means, is how much exposure you're willing to give yourself in your own project. And so, yeah, there's tons of underground things that are happening all the time. I mean, I was kind of thinking about this a little bit last night, but like there was a time where in the 90s, especially, and the early 2000s, there was this thing called mysterious guy hardcore, where all these records would come out, but like you couldn't find out anything about any of the people in the bands. You couldn't find out what, you know, who they were, where they come from, what town they were. Like, they existed just to have this, just their music was supposed to speak for itself and be its own platform. And that's as far as anybody let you get into that band. And so the mystery of it was, a lot of it was intentional and kind of stupid, I think. But I like the idea of you being able to control your amount of exposure in the world at large, and especially in a world where everything is public at all times. Like, it's really, your privacy is a really precious thing. And if you're willing to give it up for something as dumb as check out my band, and like, that's fine. But I don't know, it's really like one of the last things that we can control as a human being in 2021. So it's an important thing, I think, having underground remain underground. And I say that as a person who tries to push bands way above ground because I want them to be heard and I want people to know who they are and I want people to go see them if they're going to play in their town. And even if they're a band that never leaves their town, I still want people in that town to know they exist. And if I can help that happen, that's great. But if they don't want me to help that happen, the chances are we probably won't make a record with them. They'll just put out a tape and circulate it themselves, which is also great. I remember when the Coneheads were a thing, going back to the Coneheads bit, I called Mark Winters, I think his last name is, and I got his phone number off some tape or something, and I called him. I was like, hey, I love your band. I want to make a record. And he's just like, nah, we're just going to do our own thing. And it was like respectable, but also irritated the hell out of me because I really wanted to hear the next thing. And I knew that I was never going to see it anywhere unless I got some friend that lived in fucking Northwest Indiana to go to a show and buy the tape for me. And I was like, well, maybe. I certainly asked people because, you know, first and foremost, I mean, I'm a fan of the music. And so I want to hear it. And I'll do whatever it takes to hear it to a certain degree. So I think that the idea of playing with someone's willingness to see how far they'll go is also kind of a fun game that bands play these days, whether they say like, we're this, here's our Bandcamp page, or we're a band that you're never going to hear. Good luck. I love that. I love that push pull. So it's pretty fun to experience. I need to run and get my charger real quick because my computer's going to die. So be right back.
As for underground, I think doubling back to the conversation about the ethics of what constitutes this community is, for me, it's not necessarily about what is known or unknown, because everything is known now or knowable to anybody who's got basically internet access. And that's both historical backwards as well as what's happening in the present. But it's also, you know, are you going to play a Scion festival? You know, like you sound grindcore, you came out of the punk scene, but you're sitting down with Scion for an interview. Like that's not underground anymore. So I think you can still be a very large band. You know, you can still have DIY shows of 1,000 or 2,000 people, you know, huge, well-known among the underground, circulated among the underground and well-known, but making that conscious decision, like, I'm not willing to do this. I'm not willing, you know, like, you know, I was so into fast hardcore and grindcore because it was so unpopular, you know, and all of a sudden, all the bands that I was trading tapes with in, you know, 86, 87, 88 are on the front of like New Music Express in Britain, you know, by 90. And I'm like, holy shit, you know, and then all of a sudden, all like the punk hardcore bands were now on metal labels in the early 90s. And I'm like, fuck, you know, and it's just time and time again, this kind of process, you know, and it could relate to what Jensen's talking about as far as exposure, you know, like you make these decisions about, I mean, as a band, not necessarily a label, you know, about what kind of decisions you're willing to make for quote unquote exposure, you know, but I mean, I've seen it time and time again from friends, bands that I really liked. It is a wager you will always lose. You know, like you're going to get fucking ripped off from that record label. I've seen it so many goddamn times where, you know, somebody like, oh, I'm going to go do it, you know, and you tell them at the time, you know, I wish you well, but just know you're going into the lion's den. And sure enough, 5 years later, they're like, we got totally fucked and we still owe the label $40,000, you know, and you're like, well, you know, I hope that traversing of the underground overground boundary was worth it, you know, because I've seen it so many goddamn times. So I think underground, you know, is the decision that you make, you know, the conscious decision that you make. Like I am, you know, this is my music. This is my band. These are the labels I want to work with. This is my community. There's this other community. There's corporate media. There's this record label. It's going to mean more exposure. They're going to give me money for recording in a studio that I've never had the chance to, but you have to think, what are you trading for it? You know, and time again, you know, it's just like, you just see all these bands get ripped off and stuff. So it's not even worth it even, you know? And so my definition of underground overground is really that is basically kind of like the, you know, that kind of ethical decision that you're going to make as far as what you're willing to do, you know, and what community you want to be in. Right.
Yeah. And I will say, I do really appreciate that, Max, because I'm, you know, this particular group of people, it's not a conversation that a lot of people are having just because of how corporate, just how advertising and stuff, these things, I feel like we've been trained to just see it as part of the landscape, and we don't think about it, and we just accept it. And being a young person too, coming up, like, you're used to just see, you look at your phone and it's like 1/3 ads, and you don't, you're kind of trained a little bit to not really react or respond, or, the ads become more insidious and harder to even identify. And it's important to keep this conversation going. It's important to keep people aware of the fact that, not that, you guys are, the greatest, most righteous labels in the world, but you might be people that have people's, band's best interests in mind, and not to be sort of sold on the exposure idea. Jensen's selling a very different type of exposure here than you would be, say, like playing a festival sponsored by Red Bull or whatever, and I think that it's really good to keep having that conversation, because that hasn't changed that much. I think it just, people are more used to it now. And so you get fewer conversations about it, more and more people just accepting that South by Southwest is going to be the pinnacle of their life, and that's kind of what they set themselves up for. But although we could talk about that forever, I do want to get to some of these questions here. We are at 4:30. So if you guys don't mind, we're just going to go a few minutes over just to get a few participant questions in there. I don't want to, make people feel like they're not being heard, especially our first question asker here, Clark, because I really do want to get to his question. He says, what's the #1 release that you thought would do really well, but ended up not? And vice versa, one that you were surprised did so well. So maybe a question about your excitement about the band versus everybody else's. And maybe, Jensen, you were saying about artwork that you thought wasn't going to work and did.
Well, we released a record for Clark. So I'll just go ahead and say that our best record that we ever released was the Clark 07-inch. It sold all 200 copies that we made, and we were just blown away. And the artwork sucks though. But it was fine for the record. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know. We've released, I think we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 releases now, which is sort of staggering to think about in the space of time that we've been operating. And just earlier today, I was uploading masters and filling out forms for more releases, which still is crazy to me. But we've certainly released some records that I was dead certain were going to be good, like they were going to be hits. I was like, okay, well, great. So there was this band from Olympia called Nudity. And they asked for the world too. They were like, we want radio campaign, and we want all this kind of PR stuff, and we're gonna tour like crazy. And so I was like, oh, I don't know, because like sound wise, it sort of ends up in this like, it's like glam kind of hard rock thing, which is definitely not something that we'd released a sound like. We've never released anything that sounds like that in the past. And even John was like, dude, I don't know about this one, but I made a case for it pretty hard, because I was like, this is going to be cool. Like, I really believed it was going to work out. And then when the record came out, the band broke up and like didn't really play any shows. And that record tanked really hard, and almost kind of broke our label, because we had so much invested in it and hoping that it was going to work out, and it failed super hard. And that was a tough one to come back from. We had to work extra super hard to kind of get back into the black, which I think we're like 20 grand in the hole right now, but whatever. Is that good? I guess that's success. Sure. But, and likewise, there are other things like that we've released, for that I didn't think we're going to sell at all, and we ended up selling all of them. Torture Commer was a good one. It's a noise thing that's like super obscure. Still, I don't think anybody really knows what it is, because it's like noise and black metal, which I realize is a turnoff for a lot of people, but it's such an amazing record that I think that the people that needed that record all found it and were like, holy shit, this is amazing. And it's gone, but we never made more of them, because I think that was enough of them. Like, we stopped it right there, and that was about right. So it's nice when you kind of nail that one. But yeah, other than that, you know, Clarko, that was the one.
I mentioned earlier this record by SBSM that I think Jensen described it as like Einsters and the Neubauten, like covering dirt or like covering crossed out on like dirt's equipment or something. It was like, it's amazing record, like power electronics with live drums and yeah, it just didn't sell very well. I mean, also the band also broke up, right? Right when it came out, and that's like a huge part of it. I think it's the same thing. I put a record out for a band called Warp from San Francisco that I think is amazing. They're like an incredible live band. One of them's a mailman. They can't go on tour, and they never, like, it came out in December 2019 too. Like, it's, you know, it still sells. I sell a couple copies every week. But I don't want anyone in that band to listen to this though and think that I'm feeling like it was like some kind of disappointment. I just think they destroy live. Like, they were gonna finally go on tour and the world was like gonna get to see them, and then the world shut down. In terms of stuff I was surprised it sold so well. Not anything to do with like the sonic quality of it, but I put out 2 7-inches sort of right at the beginning of the pandemic for a band called CB Radio Gorgeous from Chicago, and one called Sniffing the Knits from London. That, you know, sort of, I actually like got some copies of that second one ready for Ellis's festival, which was like the last show on Earth or something. And then sort of sat on the rest of them for a while we were all still figuring out like what's gonna happen now, like no one has a job, where's the money, what's happening. And then both those records sold out like, you know, within a month or something, like pretty quickly. And I was just surprised about that, more from sort of a like circumstantial, you know, geopolitical economic meltdown situation. But yeah, I feel like you know, there's things to be said about like certain things that maybe sound like more like what someone might imagine a Thrilling Living band sound like. Those might sell more copies, but pretty much everything, you know, moves its way out the door. You know, it might take 2 years, but they're all gone. So
I guess just very quickly, 625's like criteria for choosing bands is what is unpopular. Like if it's good and I can hear that maybe another label is going to pick it up, I'm not going to release it. So I'm looking for, you know, bands from locales that may not have like a hotbed scene at that point, and maybe playing music that may not be popular. So basically, you know, my objective, I guess, my criteria is like, what is actually not going to sell? That's the 625 band, you know, and I'm really surprised actually when bands do actually get popular. You know, it takes a couple releases. You have to support them from the beginning through a couple EPs, and then they do an LP, and the next thing you know, Earache buys it, you know, and that's like surprising to me. But you know that I sit on thousands of records of all my old, you know, that's not surprising at all, because that was kind of the objective in the first place. So so that's a lesson not to do, kids. If you're thinking about starting a DIY label, do not do
we're not
that.
supposed to intentionally release stuff that we know is never going to sell.
Yeah, exactly.
And we have a question here. There's one technical question about records, but because this one's relevant, I'll ask it first. The question from Sam is, do you hire an outside publicist for your releases? In other words, if nobody's heard it, how do you get people to want to buy it? I mean, you might have your record label's reputation, but what else do you do? And what, stuff like that, publicity, promo. You mentioned radio, Jensen, billboards.
I've never done a billboard, but if I did, I would want it to be like an Angeline kind of billboard with just me on the front, because I think I'm a product now. No, we have hired publicists in the past. And I remember once in an interview, I want to say it was a Maximum interview or something. It was at the time where we were kind of dabbling with doing that. And it seemed like a thing where you could just hire a publicist for a record, and then that record would just become popular because you paid someone to make it popular for you. It's sort of like akin to, I see these ads on like Instagram sometimes where we get these like direct messages from people being like, pay me $400 and you'll have 100,000 followers. You know, it's like, that's essentially what dealing with publicity feels like. It's not always the case, because I've realized over the years that a publicist's value is who they know. So they're going to be friends with all the people that work at, you know, the tastemaker places, or wherever the right kind of jump off points for the records that you're trying to sell might be. And that's a really cool resource if you use it correctly. But if you want to just buy a publicist's time for 3 months, it's a pretty expensive endeavor. And you don't ever really know what's going to happen. Case in point, for that nudity record, we hired a publicist for that record, and she did a good job. But also, in the end, most of the places that we pitched the idea of this record to were not interested at all. So we still had to pay for the publicity, but we actually didn't really get a lot of publicity out of it. And so it kind of, we don't really use publicists anymore. And, you know, we've been fortunate enough to be going for long enough that we've made a lot of friends with people that are in these positions. And so we can kind of do it ourselves. Or the places that want to cover these records just kind of do it on their own, because they have good taste, and or those sites end up like accidentally hiring punks and they don't know it. It's been pretty great. So we get some funny exposure from time to time, and it's just totally by chance. But I think that if you well, I don't know where I was going with that, but anyway, yes, we have hired publicists. Generally, I don't like going that way, because it sort of goes back to the underground, overground conversation of like, where do you want this record to land? Who do you want to have listen to this thing? I would much rather have people that I would hope have like-minded opinions or similar tastes to ours to try to discover these records. And obviously we want people that are sort of outside of our sphere to hear them as well. But I don't want some like, I don't want some site being like, hey, you guys really got to check out this new fucking band, Nudity. They're the greatest thing to happen since sliced bread. And then have them go, oh, well, that site said it was really good, so I'm just going to go ahead and avoid that, because it really depends. And, and I think that having a publicist involved, they might not understand the nuances that are there, and they're not part of our little community a lot of times. And so it's really hard to sort of project what it is that draws us to this record. Like I really like the people in the band, and I really like the music that they make. And I know that these people they're good people who do things that are important. They're community builders. They're, people that are in it for the right reasons. And sometimes a publicist, even if you pick a good one, doesn't understand that. Like they don't see that. And so they can't tell, corporate site to say, hey, these people are fucking important. Here's why. They're just going to say, this rocks. Here's a picture. And so there's a lot that gets lost in that translation. I don't know, maybe it's like playing a game of telephone or something. You just, at the end, the message just gets distorted. So if you try and keep a lot of middlemen out of it, I think it's going to be a little bit more effective.
Yeah, I've never hired a publicist. Surprise. A band has never asked me to do it. There have been like 2 bands that have sort of asked for there to be some kind of like attempt at a media campaign, which involved sort of trying to pitch writers, like Jensen mentioned, that we all end up kind of knowing by being in this world, like the same kind of connections that publicists have. A lot of us have also just from like going to shows and being around people. I will say like the only piece of big writing that I have seen have a direct correlation to sales for me was Jen Pelly wrote a fabulous review of the special interest record this past year, got Best New Music on Pitchfork, and that drove like, I think I sold like 600 records the first day or something. But most of the time when like, something from my label is included in some kind of write-up of, round up the last quarter of the year on Stereo Gum or Pitchfork or like whatever, what ends up happening is, and even on the Bandcamp, like best of punk write-ups, which they include all of our labels in a lot. I don't know if this is experience that you have too. It doesn't actually generate that many sales. It'll generate, particularly some of these like bigger websites, it'll generate people come and listen to 15, 20 seconds of the song and click away. And I see much more direct correlations between, you know, information blasts and sales or whatever from like my own mailing list, or from posting it on like the label's social media, than I do from when it's mentioned in places that have like a much exponentially larger reach. I think particularly, yeah, you can like really, I mean, the data is interesting to look at sometimes when you see like, okay, where were all the referrals to this thing that got streamed? You can see on Bandcamp like how far everyone made it in the song or whatever, and it's like they're not listening to it, and they're certainly not buying it from these big sites, you know, 99% of the time. So just like, that's another thing that I think about when I think about like this sort of like deal with the devil that Max was alluding to, when you're kind of like, you know, making your compromises or doing whatever, sort of thinking about like, well, what am I going to get out of it? And, you know, they can write about, it's a free country. Anyone can write about anything that we put out into the world. It has that kind of like life of its own. But in terms of really seeking it out, I think if you are a label thinking about like wanting to do that, it's like much more about placing it with a writer who like you really trust to, you know, be like a caretaker for the vision of the band or whatever, and less about like blasting it to a million places and trying to get written about. I think like, oh yeah, I want Jen to write about this record. She'll do a great thing. Like when Mozart was reviewed in The Wire by Byron Coley, like I lost my mind. And that was like so cool for me. He wrote this like amazing 2-sentence review. And I think for me, like when bands ask me like, oh, I want this person to write about, or I want this thing, like trying to create that experience for them. Sure, that's something that I want to do. But I also want to tell them it's probably not going to sell you a ton of records, but like you want to be in The Wire, like let's figure out, let's do that. That's something that means something to you. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, it's hard to buy people's care because most people are not going to give a shit about what you're doing because they're wrapped up in their own things. So I don't know, publicity. It's a tough game. It's a hard
Max,
game.
how many publicists have you hired over the years, Max?
So just to put this in perspective, I started a website in the late 90s, and that was it. And I was doing email, and then all my friends were like, oh, you got to do this thing called MySpace. And I'm like, fuck it. I got so many goddamn emails that I got to deal with every day. I'm not going on to this new thing that's going to generate more stuff that's going to take my time. So I never transferred to social media until I talked to Brian Stern last year. And he was like, dude, your label's dead. Like you can put out records. That's fine. You think you have this website that people are going to, they're not, you know, like your label is dead unless you're on social media. So Brian Stern, Bad Skulls, he's the motherfucker who convinced me to cross that threshold onto social media, which I did not want to do. You know, and then overnight, 3,000 followers on Instagram. And I couldn't believe it. I was like, who are these people? I don't even know these people. And people are like, where have you been? I'm like, I've been here. I got an email address. It's on my website. You can email me, you know? So I have no idea. I have no idea how to promote records in this day and age. You know, I had paper ads in MRR. That was my main way of advertising things. I think I ran a 5-year straight out of date ad in MRR, mainly because I wanted to make sure that I was giving money to MRR for an ad that was basically completely out of date. And then they folded, and I'm like, holy shit, like, what do I do now? Like, how, you know, like, do zines exist? You know, like what do I do? So Instagram is my only foray. I'm still trying to navigate it. I don't even know the first thing about publicists. I don't know where to send my records. I don't know who would write about them. I don't know what blog, you know, or online magazines would even write about the releases that I would release. So I'm learning a lot from this conversation because, like, literally, if there's a quote from me for tonight is, I have no idea what I'm doing. That's gonna be my quote for the night.
But isn't that where some of the most original ideas are really born though too? Because you have no fucking clue what you're doing. So you just try things. And sometimes they work and most times they don't. So we need that too.
Yeah, so let's, I'm gonna ask a question from the chat and sort of wrap it with a final question for you guys. So SR asks, is the rising cost of records hurting the sales of them more than Spotify, et cetera, or not? Is there something else? What could cause them to come back down? More pressing plants or cheaper shipping? And I'm just gonna wrap that into just, you know, an open-ended question about what you guys feel like the future of DIY labels is, taking into account accessibility, you know, how much more expensive it might be to make a record, you know, so you kind of have to do these calculations you maybe wouldn't want to do because maybe you really want to put it out, but you know it's not going to be economically viable. What's the future of that? And for somebody wanting to start a label, right? The threshold to access it, on one hand, it's very easy. You can make, you know, put 1 million songs on the internet in a day, but to do something real, you know, is a little more complicated, you know, to make a bunch of records, or maybe it's not, you know, maybe that's what it would be nice to hear from you guys to demystify that. Maybe it's not complicated. Maybe you do have to be willing to lose a few grand, you know, so you got to have some money, but yeah, so rising cost of records, et cetera, future of DIY labels. And then to wrap it up, and you can kind of try to make this in one, do you feel like whatever your goals were when you started your label, did you succeed? Did you fail? Or, you know, in what ways have you succeeded or failed? I'd like to hear about that too. So take it away.
Boy, yeah, I don't see the costs of making records going down ever. That's just not how capitalism works. So making these things is going to continue to be more and more expensive as the years go on. But another thing that we also have to think about is that if you're making records, that's a petroleum product in the end, which is pretty damaging to the environment. And you know, the irony is that a lot of records will come out and will have these messages like, you know, you harm the earth making cars or eating McDonald's or whatever it is that is harming the environment. But realistically, that message is coming to you on a piece of plastic that is also harming the environment. So it's a weird thing that, and I really think that like in the long game future of, you know, any physical format of anything is, I don't know that there will be a lot of tangible products to be had because in one way or another, it's just going to end up damaging something else. But records are particularly brutal and so many of them get made. And yes, more pressing plants are opening. It's a popular thing again. You know, you can go to like Walmart and buy Beatles records, I guess, if you really want to. But, and so that sort of speaks to how popular just records as a format are again. And there's been a bunch of people who have sort of championed like, this is the old days and everything sounds better on vinyl. And, you know, what happened to the CD? Like, I remember when CDs came out, it completely crushed vinyl sales. Like, and it made most pressing plants just close because they could make something so cheap and so fast. And it was better in a lot of ways, but here we are, you know, I hate CDs and I never make them because I think they're stupid. But I don't really know what the future will be. I know that we'll continue to kind of roll with whatever is available and whatever is going to make sense for us to make that we feel good about making, we'll make that thing. And if not, then everything will be virtual. But music is always going to be made. There's no stopping that. And people are always going to want their music to be heard. So we'll just try and figure out the best way to do that for them, if we can.
Well, the interesting thing about CDs is like the things that you play CDs on are all obsolete at this point for the most part. And unlike a record, which like quite literally has the sound physically encoded in it, like it's physics. It's kind of a miracle that records play at all, but it's physics and you could build a primitive machine that played it back. So yeah, like obviously CDs are a scourge on the environmental earth too, but it's just interesting to think about like how really those are like, lots of stuff that was like made on CD is going to be totally lost the world. Because like it was interesting, Max, you were saying earlier, like, oh, everything is knowable if you have an internet connection. That's actually not true. I mean, I would be listening to records at maximum and be like, ooh, this got to be on YouTube. I'm gonna like put this song up on my Facebook or whatever for some people to listen to. And there's tons of stuff from like a particular period of time, you know, from the most part, that just isn't online. So, you know, what do we do about that is like a whole separate question from this question. I think too, in terms of like the costs, like there are cheaper ways to make records. I don't think anyone in this group goes the cheapest possible route. Like I have someone cut my lacquers because they sound good. They sound better. I'm not going to the plant in the Czech Republic and having the direct to metal mastering done. I have relationships with the people that I work with, and, you know, working with, you know, plants that do that, that's a choice that other people make. If I'm going to make something, it's going to cost a little bit more money, but I have a woman in Portland named Amy Dragon. She cuts all my lacquers, and like, we have a great relationship. She's fucking awesome. There are, you know, not that many women that are cutting, like doing that kind of work, that kind of mastering work. And I love to support her. She's incredible. She used to work at a pressing plant up in the Northwest too. But she's not the cheapest person by any means. And particularly like if I have her do like master from tape, like the pre-master or whatever you want to call it, like, you know, that's really, really expensive. And that can't be done for every band. Like, you know, she's orders of magnitude more expensive than working with Will, who's someone who masters a lot of my records too. You know, and it's obviously like, you know, maybe for your first record, you're not going to be able to make all of these, like, you know, these calculated risks in terms of like, I want to make the best product. Here's where I can cut the corners, or here's where I don't. I mean, for people that are listening, like I make almost all my records at Gotta Groove Records in Columbus, Ohio. They're amazing. They're, or Cleveland in Ohio somewhere. They're amazing. They're also booked out till February 2022 right now, which is like, you know, it's hard for me to even imagine what my life is going to be like then. I print all my jackets almost exclusively with Imprint in Florida. Those are like great punk people that I've had relationships with for years, both through the magazine and through the work that I do. You know, there's some, you know, utility in shopping around. Like I save probably like, you know, a minuscule amount of money by assembling all my records myself or whatever. You know, I stuff the records in the jacket myself. I go directly to Imprint rather than like Gotta Groove can manufacture my jackets too, but they're just going to call Imprint. So it's just like adding middleman on top of middleman on top of middleman. So the more that you can develop direct relationships with your vendors, you know, Imprint's not actually printing the jackets themselves. They're working with someone in Canada who's printing the jackets. Like there's all these layers, but the more that you can get in and build relationships with people who you trust the work that they're doing, you build relationships with them where they're going to be willing to help you out when you're like, hey, I have a couple questions, like what's the best way for me to get this like weird foil effect that I can afford, or like, you know, oh, this Pantone silver, like it's a little bit more money, but like, what do you recommend? People that like have expertise in these areas. If you work with them directly rather than going to sort of like one-stop shops, you both save money and end up like having more control over the end product and developing relationships that are, you know, really rewarding. I mean, I love my relationship with Amy. She's so cool. I've learned a ton from her, like, you know, and yeah, I don't know if this answers the question, but like, yeah, they're expensive. They're going to stay expensive. Shipping is crazy. There's a couple shipping secrets to shipping overseas that I'm happy to, they're not secrets. They're just like not advertised very well because FedEx doesn't want you to send, you know, a package that should cost $500 to Australia for $70, but you can do it. And I'm happy to share that information. I think like the more that we can share that kind of information rather than being like, you can go to Bandcamp or you can go to Pirates Press and they'll do everything for you, the better, more robust sort of like label or just even self-releasing ecosystem we'll have.
Yeah, and speaking to the actual production materials that it takes to make records and why they're scheduled out so long and why they're becoming more and more expensive is, I don't know if people are aware of this, but if you have a lacquer made, a lacquer cut record, which also is my preference. I'm not huge on direct metal mastering because I think it affects the sound quality, but regardless, there's only one factory in the entire world that makes the lacquers that every single record ever produced you know, in the last couple years, they have all gotten their materials from this one place in Japan. And it's extremely limited. So now they have a monopoly on this market essentially, and they know it. And so they're more expensive, but they're not like that much more expensive now that they're the only place left. Because previously there was a place in Southern California that also manufactured lacquers, but it burned down a little while ago. And, you know, I've heard that they're trying to figure it out to build a new place, but the owners kind of don't really want to. And so it's kind of like what you were saying about the parts to make, you know, to play CDs, like these places are becoming obsolete because the people who have the knowledge that it takes to make the lacquers in the first place are also not really around anymore because they're old, they're dying, they've lost interest completely. They don't make as much money on it as they hoped that they would. So it's becoming increasingly difficult to get these things made in the first place. And so if you're going to put the effort into making a record, like it's only fair that you know what you're getting yourself into and how much work you're going to have to do to actually make it a reality, you know. And then and even stemming from the lacquer factory, there's only a limited amount of people in the world that know how to cut a lacquer and make a record sound good. And we all have our preferences, and there's a pretty wide range of expertise and price to going into that. I love to use Golden mastering in Southern California. April Golden, another woman who did mastering for many years, unfortunately doesn't now, she moved away, but we love using them because they're old, John Golden is like one of the OG mastering guys who's just like, he's a dinosaur, but I mean, he's perfect. He doesn't miss a trick. And like, I've sent him some shit that is the most extreme, like insane sounding stuff. And he's just like, oh yeah, let's get into it. Like, I love a challenge, you know? And I'm like, I'm really shocked because this guy, you know, I mean, he was cutting like gold records for disco stars and shit in the 70s and 80s. And it's like, why the fuck would he want to master some noise record that I sent to him? But it's also, there aren't that many people that you can send these things to actually get them made. So you kind of have to, I don't know, you have to really love the format to want to make records in the first place. And it's tough. And, you know, and I think that bottleneck in the lacquer area is really causing a lot of delays industry wide. And I know that there is supply issues with the actual vinyl pellets too, because those are only made in a couple of places in the world. And so if those places run out, then everyone has to wait, you know, from the top down. Like Capitol Records, got to wait. Iron Lung Records, got to wait. Everybody waits. And unfortunately, since we're smaller, we have to wait a little longer, but it's okay. So I don't know. We love it. That's all it is. Yes.
Speaking to the lacquer thing too, I mean, like the morning after the Southern California lacquer manufacturer burned down, Amy emailed me and said, like, how many records do you think you're going to make in the next 5 years? I will save you the lacquers that I have. Because she got hers from Japan, and for a while it looked like the Japanese plant was only going to allow people that had already been their customers to continue to get lacquers from them. And that to me, like, really speaks to the value of, like, I'm a little guy, she cuts records for a lot bigger labels too, but like developing these relationships means that, like, the Iron Lung Records and the Thrilling Living Records of the world don't have to wait as long because she has a pile of lacquers sitting in a room for me. So that when I call her, she has something ready to cut for me. And like, that is a huge thing. And like, you know, at the end of the day, I'm not her biggest client by any means, but it's the sort of thing of like, you know, the community and the personal relationships that you build, that I encourage everyone to do. It's also like, you know, my friends, John and Jensen, like, you know, or like Max, who we never met before, but we've exchanged many emails while I was putting his outdated ad in Maximum Rock and Roll for years. And, you know, these personal relationships, not to sound like a fucking hippie or something, but like, that's an important part of what we're doing too. Not just the fact that it like helps you get your records made in a more timely and expedient manner. It's just like makes it more fun also.
I mean, it's our community, right? That's exactly what it is. So, but you got to find the right people. It's hard, takes a while, but you know, if you guys have questions about who to go to get things made, I mean, definitely ask everyone you know that makes records, because they'll all have opinions, especially if they've made more than one record. I know I certainly have people I like to work with. A lot of them are the same people that Grace works with. And so that also, it kind of speaks to, you know, how specialized those people are, and how, and they're all, and all the places that we use are all definitely punk or punk related businesses, because I feel it's important to support, you know, our community of people too, because we're a creative bunch and we want to see these things continue. So yeah, if you're thinking about making shit, you know, get at us, we'll tell you.
Max, I'll give you the last word in a second. Maybe Grace, Jensen, and Max, if you guys are down to just drop a good, like, you know, place to contact you in the chat, or even if it's your Instagram or whatever, if you don't want to give out an email. I'm sure everyone here would love to ask you to put out their band. But otherwise, Max, you know, if you're down to just wrap it up, and, you know, I don't mean to give you the last word and put any pressure on you, but as the person that's been doing this the longest and maybe having the biggest historical kind of way to contextualize it, do you want to give, and also maybe the person who sounds like changed your way of working the least, or at least has kind of done it the same, and maybe that's changing now. Just some words of encouragement, you know, for somebody, because I really, you know, like your idea, or kind of your initial kind of, the reason you started the label was nobody was going to do this, so I'm going to do it. Now, you know, people can put their music online, but what are some reasons that people might find it more rewarding to put out a tape versus just, you know, putting something on the internet?
That's a tough question. I'm starting to do a lot of tapes, and it's coming full circle, because basically before I put out my first records, I was sitting at my parents' kitchen table stuffing tapes into envelopes, you know, basically in the late 80s. And that's how everybody was trading tapes. And so, you know, writing to bands like Heresy or Napalm Death or death metal bands, or, you know, whatever. And you tape traded. And so now I feel like now I'm doing audio cassettes, and all my friends are like, you're doing fucking tapes, man. That's so 2012. I can't believe you're doing that, or whatever, you know? And I'm like, I love it, man. I'm like, oh yeah, tapes are the future. I think, to get back to one of your earlier points, I think if you're going to think about doing a label or just putting out a band, like, let's say like your friend's band, your own band, prepare to lose money. You know, like, you're not doing it to make money. And it's going to be very hard to even break even. So you got to do this as a labor of love, and a very expensive hobby, you know, but if you're passionate about it, it doesn't matter. And so, you know, also going back to your question about, you know, your original goals, have you succeeded or failed? I mean, I have failed miserably as a business. You know, every release I've lost money. Even my successful releases, I look at the end, you know, I go to my tax accountant, you know, and I'm like, you know, my tax accountant is like, can you put out bands that are more popular? And I'm like, fuck, you know, like, he's always like, you're failing, dude, you know? So have a day job, you know? Your day job sucks. Come home and do something that you love, which is, you know, putting out music that you really believe in. And, you know, don't worry about, like, you know, am I going to build a label that's going to help me pay rent and all that kind of stuff? Because most likely you're not. Or if you're making the choices to do so, you're making the wrong choices, you know, because then you're starting to make business-like choices, you know, and you're starting to think about, like, you know, profit and stuff like that. And that's not what doing a DIY, you know, punk label is about. So, you know, just if you can pool some money from your friends together to put out a band that you really, really appreciate and love, that's going to be worth it. You know, once it comes out, you know, whether you make money back, you make a little money back or whatever, if, you know, I think, you know, that's worth it. But as far as where the future is, I have no idea. Cassettes, I don't know. I have no idea. So,
well, if anyone else wants, Grace, Jensen, John, if you guys want to add anything before we wrap up here, I think that's, you know, that seems like an okay note to end on, but I'll let you guys be the judge of that.
You know, I just want to say thanks for having the panel in general. I think it's really cool. I got a couple of messages from people who said that they couldn't tune in and watch the thing, but they were genuinely interested in what we were going to have to say, because it was like, I have a friend who lives in Taiwan who wants he wants to start putting out CDs, because CDs in Taiwan make sense because that's what everybody buys there. But he's like, I have no idea what I'm doing. So I would love to tune in and watch this thing and actually get some tips on like how to approach doing certain things, how to make sure the artwork is good, how to make sure that, you know, it's getting mastered the right way, or that the band is like, you know, they know, as long as somebody knows what they're doing, it would be really helpful. So I just wanted to say thanks for putting this together and having us be able to, you know, come and kind of share our knowledge, because, you know, collectively I think we've all been releasing records for 1,000 years or something, since the beginning of records, probably, if you want to add up all the years. But anyway, but yeah, thanks for putting it together. I think it's a really cool thing, and I was happy to share what I know.
Yeah, thank you guys. Thank you very much. Grace, anything to add?
I just have one final thing, which is the question to like put to the group, not to be answered now, but like just pushing back a little bit on what Max said about like being prepared to lose money. I think as a community, like we're like 4 white people sitting here, white cis people, you know, and thinking about like who has access to a spare, you know, $3,000 or a couple $1,000 to start things, and how can we like redistribute resources beyond knowledge to other people who like in the punk scene who have maybe been like excluded from capital for certain reasons that go way beyond the punk scene, and, you know, start looking at like this kind of like scope of global oppression. And obviously like our hobby labels are not the thing to solve that, but it's just something that I think has been like a big conversation in punk in the past couple of years about sort of meaningful inclusivity and meaningful diversity and meaningful representation, and thinking about how like this is perhaps the thing beyond like getting a ton of gear, where like the most capital is like tied up in like being able to participate in running a label, and just thinking about like who has access to that capital and why, and like what can we do to you know, spread the wealth, so to speak. But yeah, thank you very much for inviting me to this. You know, I love running my label, and it's a really fun thing. I'm gonna pack some records up after I get off the call that have been building up for a couple days now. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone's perspective, and anyone listening, please feel free to get in touch with any questions you might have.
All right.
Awesome. Yeah. And you guys dropped your contacts in the chat there, and this, you know, we are recording this. So, you know, at some point we'll probably put it up on the kind of Holland YouTube so people can watch it later, and you can tell your buddy Jensen to check it out there. That'll be up there soon. I'll let you guys know when.
I look forward to all the demos that are going to get emailed to me.
All right, everybody. Have
Yeah,
a good
thank you.
Saturday.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks
everybody.
again. And yeah, check out the Holland Project for more of these things. We'll probably do some more sometime soon. Thanks, guys.
See y'all.